I remember thinking this was going to be a quiet Saturday until I saw the front end of a white BMW sitting inside my garage like it had always belonged there. The smell hit me first, hot rubber and expensive perfume mixing with the familiar scent of motor oil and cold steel that usually meant I was about to get paid, not disrespected. I stood there for a second, keys still in my hand, listening to the faint ticking of her engine cooling down in a space that paid my mortgage, fed my business, and kept my life running. That garage wasn't just a place to park. It was my shop, my contract zone, my livelihood measured in weld beads and billable hours. And she had just turned it into her personal parking spot. What she didn't know? I don't argue when someone crosses a line like that. I document it. My name's Ethan Cole. I'm a certified welder, 15 years on commercial sites from Houston to Denver, and I know exactly where property lines end and liability begins. That garage, it's listed as an active work zone under my insurance, which means anything inside it, anything, becomes part of a controlled environment. I walked closer, boots crunching on fine metal shavings, fingers brushing against the cool edge of my welding table as I circled her car. Black interior, engine still warm, keys gone. Of course, Brenda Whitmore never did anything halfway. HOA president, self-appointed queen of curb appeal, the kind of woman who measures grass height with a ruler and smiles like she's doing you a favor while writing you up. This wasn't her first move. 2 weeks ago, she flagged my truck for a commercial presence. Last week, she taped a violation notice to my garage door for excessive mechanical activity. I still remember the way her voice sounded, smooth, rehearsed, like she'd practiced being right her whole life. And now she was parked inside my space. Not in front of it, not blocking it. Inside, like she owned it. I stepped back and pulled out my phone, thumbs swiping through my camera app out of habit, not panic. The frame lined up perfectly, license plate, garage interior, my posted sign. Private property, active work zone, NO unauthorized entry. I took 3 shots. Then I took a 4th, slower, steady. Documentation beats frustration every time. The neighborhood was quiet. Sprinklers ticking somewhere down the street. Wind brushing through identical trimmed hedges. Nobody watching. Nobody stepping in. They never do with people like her. I slid my phone back into my pocket and looked at the garage door track, running my hand along the steel rail like I was checking alignment. Smooth. Solid. Built to hold. My welding rig sat in the corner, silent, waiting. There's a moment in every job where you decide if you're fixing something or teaching something. I reached for the control panel and pressed the button. The garage doors started coming down with that slow mechanical hum, shadows stretching across the polished hood of her car as sunlight disappeared inch by inch. I didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just stood there, listening to the sound of metal doing exactly what it was designed to do. By the time that door sealed shut with a clean, final thud, I already knew how this was going to end. She thought she parked for convenience. She didn't realize she had just entered a job site. And on my job sites, everything gets locked into place. The hum of the garage door motor faded into silence, and for a moment all I could hear was my own breathing and the faint tick of cooling metal trapped behind that steel barrier. I stood there with my hand still resting on the control panel, feeling the vibration settle into nothing, like the house itself had just exhaled. The air smelled different now, heavier, like something had shifted from routine into something deliberate. I walked over to my welding rig and flipped open the protective cover, the hinges creaking in a way that sounded almost impatient. My fingers traced the handle of the torch, familiar weight, familiar balance, like picking up a tool I had trusted for half my life. 15 years of running beads along structural steel, sealing joints that held up entire buildings, bridges, things that people never questioned once they were done right. That same skill was about to be applied here, just on a smaller scale, but with a very different kind of pressure behind it. I crouched down near the base of the garage door and ran my hand along the seam where the door met the concrete floor, feeling for gaps, checking alignment out of pure habit. Solid. No flex. Good anchor points. My mind was already mapping the weld lines before I even struck an arc. Not sloppy. Not emotional. Clean, precise, intentional. Because this was not about anger. This was about control. I pulled my phone out again and opened the time-stamped photos, making sure everything was clear, making sure her license plate and my posted warning sign were both visible in the same frame. Documentation first. Always. The legal side of things mattered just as much as the physical. Maybe more. I walked back toward the driveway and glanced up and down the street. Same trim lawns. Same identical mailboxes. Same quiet compliance that made people like Brenda think they could rewrite boundaries just by acting confident enough. A sprinkler hissed somewhere to my left, rhythmic and indifferent. No one stepped outside. No one asked questions. That was fine. I never needed an audience. I stepped back into the garage area and rolled the welding machine into position, the wheels clicking softly over the concrete. The cable dragged behind it with that familiar scraping sound, like a warning being drawn out slowly. I adjusted my gloves, tightened them around my wrists, feeling the leather settle into place. There is a certain calm that comes right before you strike an arc, a kind of clarity that blocks out everything except the line you are about to create. I lowered the helmet over my face, and the world dimmed instantly, reducing everything to shapes and intent. The torch sparked to life with a sharp crack, blue light flaring against the metal seam, and the first bead formed, smooth and controlled, fusing steel to steel in a way that was not meant to be undone quickly. The smell of heated metal filled the air, sharp and clean, cutting through everything else. I moved slowly, methodically, sealing each point along the frame, not rushing, not overdoing it, just enough to hold, just enough to make sure that door was not opening without tools, time, and a very good explanation. By the time I lifted the helmet, again, a thin line of hardened weld ran across the lower seam, quiet and permanent. I wiped my glove across my forehead, feeling the heat linger on my skin, and stepped back to look at the work. It did not look dramatic. It did not need to. It looked finished. I coiled the cable back onto the machine and powered everything down, the silence returning just as quickly as it had been broken. Then I walked to my front door, grabbed the small pre-written sign I kept for job sites, and taped it across the center of the garage. Active work zone. Do not open. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze before settling flat against the metal. I stood there for a second, reading it like I had never seen it before, and then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my truck keys, and headed toward the driveway. Because the best part about setting something in motion is knowing you do not have to stand there and watch it happen. The tires of my truck rolled over the gravel at the edge of my driveway with a steady crunch, the kind of sound that usually meant I was heading out to a job site, not walking away from one I had just created. The morning sun sat low, casting long shadows across the quiet street, everything looking exactly the same as it had an hour ago. Except now there was a sealed garage sitting behind me with a situation quietly waiting to unfold. I did not look back right away. I never do. There is a certain confidence in knowing the setup is solid, that every detail has been placed exactly where it needs to be. I reached the end of the driveway and paused, resting my arm on the open window, letting the engine idle as I finally glanced in the rearview mirror. The garage door looked ordinary. Flat. Closed. No sign of what was sitting behind it or what it now represented. Just another suburban facade hiding something a little more complicated beneath the surface. I shifted the truck into drive and pulled out onto the street, the neighborhood slipping past in clean lines of trimmed hedges and identical siding, each house carrying that same quiet agreement to not get involved. It took about 15 minutes before my phone buzzed for the first time. I did not even need to check the screen to know who it was. The vibration had a certain urgency to it, sharp and repetitive, like someone pressing harder with each call. I let it go. The second call came less than a minute later. Then a third. By the time I reached the main road, the screen lit up again, and this time I glanced down just long enough to confirm it. Brenda Whitmore. I almost smiled, but it was not amusement. It was recognition. Predictable behavior is easy to plan around. I tapped the phone once and sent it straight to silence, setting it face down on the passenger seat. The road opened up ahead of me, two clean lanes stretching toward the highway, and I pressed the accelerator just enough to feel the truck settle into a steady pace. There is a difference between reacting and allowing something to play out, and I had chosen the second option the moment I struck that first weld. Another buzz, then another, then a pause. That pause told me more than the calls did. That was the moment she stopped trying to control the situation directly and started looking for another angle. I could picture it without being there. Her standing in front of that garage door, phone pressed to her ear, voice tight, trying to explain something that sounded ridiculous even as she said it out loud. The sign on the door would be the first thing she noticed. Active work zone. Do not open. Simple. Clear. Not aggressive. Just enough to shift responsibility. Because once that label is in place, the rules change. Liability becomes real. Authority gets complicated. And people like Brenda rely on simple authority, not complicated ones. I merged onto the highway, the sound of tires against asphalt turning into a low, steady hum, and the city started to rise in the distance, glass and steel catching the morning light. My phone buzzed again, longer this time, followed by a message notification that lit up the screen briefly before fading. I did not need to read it. Not yet. Timing matters more than content in situations like this. Let them escalate. Let them call who they think can fix it. Every extra step they take without understanding the full picture only tightens the position they have put themselves in. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and leaned back slightly, letting the seat absorb the tension I was not carrying anymore. Behind me, in that quiet, perfectly maintained neighborhood, a problem was growing inside a sealed space, and for once, I was not the one being asked to solve it. By the time I crossed state lines, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Like I had stepped out of a pressure zone I did not even realize I had been standing in for weeks. The highway stretched ahead in long, clean miles, the kind that let your mind settle into a steady rhythm, engine noise blending with the low hum of tires against asphalt. I finally picked up my phone at a rest stop just past a faded sign that read 200 miles to the next major city. The screen lit up with notifications stacked on top of each other, missed calls, voicemails, text messages, all clustered under one name like a pattern that had been building without me. Brenda Whitmore. I opened the first voicemail and held the phone to my ear, leaning against the side of my truck as a warm breeze carried the faint smell of gasoline and sun-baked pavement across the lot. Her voice came through tight and controlled at first, the kind of tone people use when they still believe they are in charge of the situation. Ethan, I do not know what you think you are doing, but you need to come back immediately and open that garage. This is not acceptable. There was a pause, then the second message, recorded less than 10 minutes later. The control had slipped just enough to hear it. Simple. Back there, rules were tools, bent and reshaped by whoever spoke the loudest. I scrolled through the text messages next. Short at first, then longer, then fragmented. Call me now. This is illegal. You are making this worse. The last one made me pause for a second. The officer says you need to return immediately. I read that one twice, not because it worried me, but because it confirmed exactly where the situation had gone. She had escalated it to authority, expecting that authority to override everything else. That only works when the foundation is weak. Mine was not. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, feeling the weight of it settle there like a reminder rather than a concern. Somewhere behind me, in that quiet neighborhood, there would be a patrol car parked at the curb, an officer standing in front of a sealed garage door with a printed sign taped across it, reading words that were not suggestions but declarations. Active work zone. Do not open. Those words change conversations. They introduce liability. They slow people down. Because opening that door without the right conditions is not just a favor, it becomes a decision with consequences. I could almost see it, the officer reading the sign, looking at the weld line along the base, realizing this was not a simple lock or a stuck mechanism. This was intentional, structured, something that required tools, permission, and a very clear understanding of who had the right to authorize it. And standing next to him would be Brenda, expecting a quick resolution, expecting someone else to fix what she had walked into without asking. I pushed off the side of the truck and opened the door, sliding back into the driver's seat as the leather warmed under the afternoon sun. The engine turned over with a low, steady rumble, and I pulled back onto the road without hesitation. Because at this point, the situation was no longer about me being there. It was about everything I had already put in place before I left. And the more time that passed, the clearer that would become to everyone involved. The sun was starting to dip by the time I pulled into a small motel just off the highway, the kind with flickering neon signs and a gravel lot that crunched under your tires like dry cereal. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, letting the quiet settle in again, different from the silence back home. This one did not carry tension. This one just existed. I reached for my phone again, knowing the situation had evolved without me needing to be there. The screen lit up instantly, more messages, more missed calls, but now there were new names mixed in with hers. Unknown numbers. One labeled County Dispatch. Another marked HOA Board. That told me everything I needed to know. She had escalated beyond herself, pulled in people who operate on process instead of ego. That was where things start to shift. I opened a voicemail from an unfamiliar number and held the phone to my ear as I stepped out of the truck, the warm air wrapping around me with the faint smell of dust and distant traffic. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the kind of tone that comes from someone trained not to assume. Mr. Cole, this is Officer Daniels with County Police. We have been called regarding a vehicle inside your garage that cannot be accessed. We would like to speak with you when you are available. No urgency, no demand, just a request. That alone told me he had already seen enough to understand this was not a simple complaint. I listened to the next message, this one from Brenda again, but the tone had changed. Less authority, more pressure. You need to call them back. They are saying they cannot open the door without your permission. This is getting out of hand. I leaned against the truck and let out a slow breath, feeling the corners of the situation tighten exactly the way I expected. Not chaos. Structure. I opened my messages and scrolled until I found a photo notification from my security system. The image loaded slowly, then sharpened into a clear frame of my driveway. There it was. A patrol car parked at the curb, lights off. Two figures standing in front of the garage. One in uniform, posture relaxed but attentive. The other one, arms crossed, stance rigid. Even from a distance I could recognize that silhouette. Brenda. The sign was still visible on the door, flat against the metal, impossible to ignore. I zoomed in slightly, just enough to catch the angle of the officer's head as he read it, then looked down toward the base of the door where the weld line sat like a quiet underline beneath the whole situation. That detail mattered. That was the difference between a locked door and a secured work zone. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, then grabbed my small overnight bag from the passenger seat. The motel door creaked open as I stepped inside, the air conditioning humming loudly, pushing out a wave of cold air that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old carpet. I set the bag down on the bed and sat on the edge for a moment, elbows resting on my knees, hands clasped loosely together. There is a point where a situation stops being about reaction and becomes about patience. This was that point. Back home, they were standing in front of a closed system, one that required the right person, the right conditions, and the right acknowledgement of ownership to move forward. And for the first time since she decided to take something that was not hers, Brenda was the one waiting on someone else to fix it. Not commanding, not directing, waiting. I leaned back slowly and looked up at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the air unit. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself to fully relax. Because everything that needed to happen next was already in motion, and none of it required me to rush back and undo a single thing I had done. I woke up to the low hum of the motel air conditioner and the faint rattle of a semi-truck passing somewhere out on the highway, the kind of sound that reminds you the world keeps moving whether you are part of the problem or not. For a few seconds, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle in before reaching over to grab my phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up instantly, brighter than the room, and the notification count had doubled overnight. That was expected. Pressure builds faster when there is no easy release. I sat up slowly, resting my back against the headboard as I started scrolling. More missed calls from Brenda. Several from unknown numbers. 2 from Officer Daniels. But now there were messages too, and messages always tell a clearer story than calls. Calls are emotion. Messages are documentation. The first one from Daniels was straightforward. Mr. Cole, following up regarding the vehicle situation. No action taken at this time, due to posted work zone notice. Please contact when available. I read that twice, not because I needed to, but because it confirmed the exact boundary I had built. No action taken. That meant no one had touched the door. No one had tried to force anything. The system was holding. The next message was from a number labeled HOA Board Secretary. That one had a different tone, more formal, carefully worded. We request clarification regarding access to your garage as it relates to a current dispute involving HOA leadership. I almost laughed at that word. Dispute. That is what people call it when they realize they cannot control something directly anymore. I stood up and walked over to the small window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the morning light spill into the room. Outside, the gravel lot sat still, a few cars scattered, nothing urgent, nothing demanding attention. That contrast made everything clearer. Back home, urgency was building. Out here, everything stayed simple. I opened my security app and tapped into the live feed. The image came through with a slight delay, then sharpened into the front of my house. The patrol car was still there, but now there was another vehicle parked behind it. Dark sedan, likely HOA. Two more figures stood near the garage, one of them gesturing toward the sign, the other with a clipboard, posture stiff, like someone trying to turn a situation into paperwork. Brenda was pacing now, small tight circles, phone pressed to her ear again. Even without sound, I could read the energy. Frustration mixed with disbelief. That is what happens when someone expects instant authority and runs into structure instead. I watched as Officer Daniels stepped slightly back from the door, arms relaxed, not intervening, just observing. That detail mattered. He was not escalating. He was waiting. Because from his perspective, there was no immediate threat, no emergency, just a secured space with a clearly marked boundary. And once that label is in place, everything slows down. I zoomed in just enough to see the lower seam of the garage door again, the weld line catching a thin strip of sunlight, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. That line was doing its job quietly, holding everything exactly where it needed to be. I lowered the phone and set it on the table, letting out a slow breath as I reached for my boots. The leather felt solid in my hands, grounding in a way that reminded me this was still my work, just playing out at a different distance. I was not rushing back. Not yet. Timing still mattered. Every minute they stood there without resolution reinforced the same fact. Access required permission. Authority required proof. And neither of those belonged to the person who had walked into that garage without asking. By mid-morning, the rhythm of everything shifted from reaction to negotiation, and I could feel it even from 100 miles away. I sat at a small diner just off the highway, coffee steaming in front of me, the smell of bacon grease and burnt toast hanging in the air, while my phone rested face up on the table like it had something to say before I even touched it. When I finally picked it up, the pattern had changed. Fewer missed calls, more messages, longer ones. That meant someone had started explaining things to her, and she was starting to understand that this was not going to resolve with a raised voice or a quick demand. I opened the latest message from Officer Daniels first. Mr. Cole, we have spoken with all parties on site. No immediate enforcement action applies. Requesting confirmation of your return timeline to coordinate access. That word again. Coordinate. Not order. Not demand. That told me everything had slowed down into process. I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitter heat settle, and opened the next message. Brenda this time, but it was not the same tone anymore. This has gone far enough. We need to resolve this today. The board is getting involved. I leaned back slightly in the booth, watching a waitress refill someone's cup across the room, her movements calm, routine, nothing urgent. That contrast made the message feel even louder than it actually was. Resolve. That is what people say when they realize they are not winning. I opened the security feed again, resting my elbows on the table as the image loaded. The scene had changed just enough to matter. The patrol car was gone now, replaced by that same dark sedan and another vehicle I recognized as a local contractor's truck. That detail made me pause. Someone had tried to bring in tools. I zoomed in, focusing on the garage door. The sign was still there, slightly creased now, but holding. And standing in front of it was a man in a work shirt, arms crossed, looking down at the weld line with the kind of expression that comes from experience. He knew what he was looking at. He knew it was not a quick fix. I watched as he shook his head slowly, said something I could not hear, and stepped back. That was the moment everything locked into place. Because once a professional confirms something cannot be casually undone, the conversation changes completely. It stops being about what someone wants and becomes about what is actually possible. Brenda stood off to the side now, no longer pacing, just watching, her phone lowered for once. Even from a distance, I could see the shift in her posture. Less control, more waiting. I set the phone down and stared at it for a second, letting that image settle in my mind. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a lesson unfolding in real time, one step at a time, each piece reinforcing the same boundary she had ignored. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys, turning them over in my hand slowly, feeling the familiar weight. There is a point where you step back in, not because you have to, but because the situation has reached the exact place you intended it to reach. I finished my coffee, set a few bills on the table, and stood up, the chair scraping lightly against the floor. As I walked out into the bright midday sun, the heat hitting my face, I already knew what the next part required. Not urgency, not anger, just timing. Because by the time I got back, no one would be asking why the door was closed. They would be asking how to open it the right way. The drive back felt shorter, not because the miles had changed, but because the outcome already had shape. The highway stretched ahead in long, clean lines, sunlight bouncing off the hood of my truck while the engine held a steady rhythm beneath me. I did not rush. Speed would not change anything at this point. What mattered was arriving at the exact moment the situation had settled into clarity. By the time I turned off the main road and into my neighborhood, the air felt familiar again, trimmed lawns, quiet sidewalks, the same controlled stillness that had been there when I left. But now there was something underneath it. Tension that had nowhere to go. I could see it before I even reached my driveway. 2 vehicles parked along the curb. The dark sedan still there. The contractor truck too. And a small cluster of people standing in front of my garage, like they were waiting for a door that refused to acknowledge them. I eased the truck to a stop at the edge of my driveway, the tires crunching softly against the concrete as every head turned in my direction at the same time. That moment always tells you everything. Who has control? Who is waiting? Who needs something? I stepped out slowly, closing the door with a solid click, and the first thing that hit me was the heat radiating off the garage door, carrying that faint metallic scent that lingers after steel has been worked and left to settle. The sign was still there, slightly wrinkled now, but intact. Active work zone. Do not open. Clear. Unchanged. Officer Daniels was not there anymore. That meant he had already done what he needed to do and stepped back. What remained was a conversation, not enforcement. Brenda stood a few feet off to the side, arms crossed, but not as tight as before, her posture caught somewhere between frustration and calculation. The contractor leaned against his truck, shaking his head slightly when our eyes met, like he had already delivered his professional opinion and had no interest in repeating it. One of the board members stepped forward first, clipboard in hand, trying to take control of the moment. "Mr. Cole, we need to resolve this immediately." His voice was firm, but it lacked weight. I did not respond right away. I just walked past him, boots echoing lightly against the concrete as I stopped in front of the garage door and looked at it like I was inspecting a job I had finished the day before. I crouched down slightly, running my hand along the weld line, feeling the smooth, cooled metal, checking it out of habit more than necessity. Solid. Exactly as intended. I stood back up and turned to face them, letting a few seconds pass before speaking. "You brought someone to open it?" I asked, nodding toward the contractor. The man gave a short laugh under his breath. "Not without your authorization and a full liability release. That is a work zone now." His words landed heavier than anything I could have said myself. I looked back at the board member. "Then you already have your answer." Brenda stepped forward then, finally closing the distance, her voice lower now, controlled, but carrying something different. "Not authority. Not anymore. This needs to end today." I met her gaze without raising my voice. "It can." The moment we acknowledge how it started. Silence settled between us, thick but not chaotic. Structured. Because now the situation had reached its final shape. Not a conflict. A boundary that had been crossed and sealed, waiting for the right terms to open again. And for the first time since she stepped into that space, she was not deciding what happened next. She was waiting to hear it. I let the silence sit for a few seconds longer, long enough for everyone standing there to feel the weight of it, the kind that does not come from noise but from understanding. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen a few times before turning it toward the group. The image was clear. Time-stamped photos of her car inside my garage. The posted warning sign. The angle that showed everything in one frame. No confusion, no interpretation needed. "This is how it started," I said, my voice steady, not raised, not aggressive, just clear. The board member leaned in slightly, eyes scanning the screen, his posture shifting almost. Immediately as the pieces connected in his head. Documentation changes everything. Brenda did not step closer. She stayed where she was, arms loosening at her sides, her focus locked on the ground for a moment before she looked back up. Not defiant this time. Calculating. "You could have handled this differently," she said. But the edge was gone from her voice, replaced by something that sounded more like an attempt to regain footing than an actual argument. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and nodded once. I did handle it, in a way that makes sure it does not happen again. The contractor let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost like a laugh he decided not to finish, and pushed himself off his truck, clearly done being part of something that had already reached its conclusion. The board member cleared his throat and adjusted his grip on the clipboard, shifting into a tone that felt more official now, less performative. "What do you need to reopen access?" There it was. Not a demand. A question. I glanced back at the garage door, at the weld line that had held everything exactly where it needed to be, then back at them. Acknowledgement of trespass. Written. Filed with the board. And a formal update to the HOA guidelines clarifying that private work zones are not subject to temporary access claims. Each word landed clean, not rushed, not emotional, just precise. The kind of language that leaves very little room to twist later. The board member hesitated for half a second, then nodded slowly, already understanding that this was no longer about preference. It was about correction. Brenda exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the shift. "Fine," she said, the word coming out controlled but thinner than anything she had said before. Not agreement from power. Agreement from position. I stepped back once, giving the space a different kind of distance now, and gestured lightly toward the door. "Once that is done, I will remove the welds. Properly. Safely." The contractor nodded at that, finally speaking again. "That is the only way this opens without damage." Another confirmation. Another layer locking everything into place. The board member scribbled something down, already moving into process mode, and I could see the structure forming around the resolution just like I had intended from the start. Not chaos. Not escalation. Correction. I took one last look at the garage, the sign, the sealed line that had turned a simple boundary into something impossible to ignore, and then I turned back toward my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots with each step. Behind me, the conversation continued, quieter now, more controlled, like a system adjusting itself after being forced to recognize a limit. I opened the door and paused for just a second before getting in, letting the moment settle fully. She parked in a space she thought she could take. I turned it into a boundary she could not cross. And the next time she saw that garage door, she was going to remember exactly why it stayed closed until the rules were finally written the right way.